Hello, this is International Master Andrew Martin here, and welcome to my presentation on the Modern Scandinavian for Foxy Openings. Of course, this is the second time I've produced such a DVD. We're going to be looking at Black's energetic modern variation, starting with knight f6 here, and I believe that this is a playable line for Black, moreover quite interesting, and there's some very sharp lines which you can catch an unprepared opponent on the nose with when you employ this enterprising variation. What I'd like to do now is to go through the variations I'll be examining on the DVD to give you a flavour of the repertoire for Black. Well, White has quite a few moves here, and the first move we're going to be looking at is bishop b5 check. This is an attempt to more or less refute Black's system, as after the normal blocking move, bishop d7, White's going to retreat his bishop, maybe with bishop c4, and try to hang on to the extra pawn. That's not the only retreat for the bishop. Well, bishop takes d7 is actually very insipid. So going back, White may try a move like bishop e2. That can be answered by knight takes d5. Moreover, after bishop c4, Black has interesting jabs at the White position, maybe with b5, or possibly even with the more common move here, bishop g4, hitting the White queen and uncovering an attack on d5. So if White wants to keep the game on the boil, he's got to play f3. Well, as we'll see, this is the move which loosens up White's position and gives Black good counterplay. Now, bishop d7 is a different recommendation to my earlier thoughts on this subject. On the early Foxy Openings DVD, produced in the 1990s, I thought Black might try knight bd7. Well, I think what I'm saying is both moves are playable, knight bd7 or bishop d7. Bishop d7 is less sharp to start off with, but that's a good move. Bishop b5 check, as I've said, is an attempt to refute Black's opening, but White doesn't really succeed. I'll show that Black has plenty of play in this line. Let's go back to knight f6 now. Of course, knight f6 is a direct attack on the pawn at d5, so it seems natural for White to defend that pawn with c4. As usual, this type of move is the acid test of Black's variation. And here I'm going to recommend still, because this was my recommendation on the first DVD, the Icelandic gambit with e6. I believe this is a move which gives Black a lot of sharp play. I think the sacrifice is more or less sound, practically over the board. It can lead to disaster for White if he doesn't know what he's doing. And even if he does know what he's doing, I think this DVD will enrich Black's chances. For instance, in the line d takes e6, bishop takes e6, and now knight f3, which was thought to be quite a severe test of Black's resources back in the late 1990s, when this variation started to become really popular, as Black demolished opponent after opponent with it. Well, here I'm going to show that queen e7 is actually a pretty interesting choice for Black. That move not only threatens a deadly discovered check, it also gets on with development and prepares knight c6 and castle on the queen side as quickly as possible. That's just one line in the Icelandic gambit, but I think the Icelandic gambit is a good way for Black, and the nice thing about it is if White declines the gambit, let's say he plays a natural move like d4, well then e takes d5 just gives Black a decent variation of the French, as we will see, where White's been lured into playing some sort of very unusual exchange variation. Going back to knight f6 one more time then, the third main line, and perhaps White's most common choice at Grandmaster level, is the safe and sober move d4. White intends to follow up knight takes d5 with simply knight f3. Develop logically and, well, more or less invite Black to equalise. This is a slightly different way of playing for Black than the one I recommended earlier on. There I was looking at the Jadul variation, that's bishop g4. I'm not at all sure whether that's 100% sound. It's still possible today, but, well, why not go knight takes d5 if it's playable? And after knight f3, a move which Gata Kamsky, the legendary American grandmaster, has been playing recently, and many strong players too, the solid move bishop g4. I believe this is a good way to get a pretty decent position with Black, and certainly at club level. You know, if you know the themes and ideas running through this move, then you're going to get a good game every time. So that will be my recommendation here. Just dropping back one move to knight takes d5. Of course, white can play a move like c4. Then we're going to drop away with knight b6. And in this position, white's got to be a bit careful that black doesn't jab at him with moves like e5 early on. There are some interesting counters against white's early central advance that black can try in this line. And usually white prefers to delay c4, preferring to develop his kingside pieces first. Now, going back to knight f6 one more time, knight f3 was recommended to many white players when the Jadot variation started to take off for black. Of course, this is a move which frustrates black's idea of going bishop g4 after d4, because white hasn't played d4 yet. But of course, this conforms with our main line, because black can just play knight takes d5, and after d4, bishop g4, we're back in what we know. Meanwhile, we just go back to knight f3, knight takes d5. If white goes c4 in this position and follows up with d4, then again black gets a satisfactory game by playing bishop g4. The nice thing about the Scandinavian, and it's always an aspect of the opening I've liked, is that black is more or less forcing white to do his bidding right from the off. The Scandinavian is a very forcing opening from the black side, and so there are very few casual moves that white can get away with in this position and hope for equality, and hope to get the advantage with, excuse me. So I think we've covered most of them. Bishop b5 checks c4, d4, knight f3. There are a couple moves remaining which we'll cover briefly on this DVD. Knight c3, it's well known that black has a very easy path to equality simply with knight takes d5 against that. And finally there's the move bishop e2, which was a recommendation of Nigel Davis. But again, knight takes d5, d4 shouldn't lead to too many problems for black, as we'll see. Alright, well that's the repertoire I'm recommending for black on this DVD. Now it's time to go into a bit more detail. Well, the first variation I'd like to look at in the modern line is the one where white plays bishop b5 check on move 3. This is a variation which was employed by Bobby Fischer and many strong players in their time, and it's an attempt to disrupt the whole black game plan. The check is a little bit awkward for black, in that what black would like to do in this position is just basically to take the d5 pawn without too many tears. Bishop b5 encourages black to interrupt the check with something, with a knight or the bishop, given that c6 is really not a very sound move in this position. I just can't see that working as a line for black. And when black puts something in the way, white retreats his bishop, let's say to c4, and now black is left with a bishop on d7 that's not really on the right square, blocking in the knight on b8, and some work to do to regain that pawn on d5. Meanwhile, white just develops. I don't think white entertains too many ideas of holding that pawn forever on d5, just for long enough to make black's development difficult. Which brings me to my first game, and it's from the French Championship all the way back in 1983. But this is not a line really which is at the forefront of modern theory. You're not going to see this line being debated in Super Grandmaster tournaments day in, day out, and thus the attention of the top players in the world isn't really fixed on it. This of course gives us a supremely practical weapon if we really learn what to do with black in this position. And the right move after bishop c4 in my view is definitely bishop g4, opening up fire against the pawn on d5 once more and attacking the white queen. And if white wants to make anything of this position, he's got to play f3, which, okay, keeps the pawn for the time being, but it's not really the move white wants to make as such, because it interrupts the natural flow of white's development. The knight on g1 is now thinking about where to go, and the queen is blocked in. So now bishop f5, and this is the game Lamorel versus Goldenberg, Belfort, 1983. Okay, well, white brings his knight out to c3. Having played f3, then I think white's got to protect his pawn and make life difficult for black to get that pawn back, for as long as it takes to get the pieces out. So naturally knight c3, black plays knight bd7, immediately threatening knight to b6, and white plays his queen to e2. We're going to take a look at the move knight ge2 in the next game. But for the time being, knight bd7. Lamoureux played queen e2. Knight b6 was played. And now white retreated the bishop to b3. I mean, I think clearly bishop b5 check is another move. Then black has to retreat his bishop to d7. But now you see it's a little bit awkward for white as to what he actually plays. Black's threat is probably just to regain this pawn with the help of moves such as a6. After a6, white's going to have to make a decision. Do I take on d7? And what other move has he got, really? And thanks to the move f3, if white doesn't keep the pawn on d5 for a while, then really I prefer black's position. I just see a normal type of position with this horrible move at f3 thrown in. So that's why Lamoureux rejects the check and just brings his bishop back to b3. And now comes queen to d7. That move cuts out a check on b5 from the queen. For instance, if black had gone, let's say, knight takes d5, well then knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and now queen b5 check is very awkward. Black's only move here to protect the knight is c6, and now white can come down and chomp on b7. So that's not what black wants to happen in this position. Thus black has to temporise for the time being playing queen d7, but now he's definitely threatening to take his pawn back. And I don't think white has a good way of stopping it. So, d6. This is a very disruptive move. White recognises that he's not going to be able to keep the pawn. Thus he jettisons it in what he thinks is the most awkward way for black to meet. Queen takes d6, and now the idea is knight b5. And after queen d7, a necessary move protecting the bishop, white moves in with the tactical strike, queen e5. And it looks suddenly as though it might be difficult for black to defend that pawn on c7. Okay, all this is known. Black must continue in energetic vein. Goldenberg castled. White's setup makes no sense whatsoever. He doesn't go in and take the pawn on a7. That's exactly what happened. White brought his knight back, and black played knight fd5. So black has deliberately sacrificed this pawn. Let's get it into our head. In return, he's got a huge advantage in development. He's got moves like f6 and e5 coming up, taking the centre. He's got moves like knight b4 in the pipeline. And, of course, immediately, black is hitting the knight on b5. So, it's not that easy for white here. Okay, you could argue the black queen is chained to the bishop on f5 in this position. It's not so easy for white, for black to just take that knight off. But this is an awkward position for white. Practically, at least. And Lamoureux played a natural move here, d4. In a previous game, the move a4 was played. This is the game Campbell versus Gibbons in Melbourne, 2002. And a lot of club players would make that move. I believe in that game, Gibbons responded poorly with e6. That's far too casual a solution to the problems of this position. And in fact, f6 is a much better move. So good is f6 that I think a4 will be made to look inadequate. For instance, if white plays queen e2, now knight b4 is a good move. Hitting c2, making room for the b6 knight, should white play a5 to come to d5. And now you see white has problems. He's got problems defending c2, surprising problems. For instance, if white went d4 in this position, I mean, who's to say that black couldn't take on c2 straight away? And if we get a couple of captures there, now black can take on b5. White is going to struggle in this position because he's behind in development. Black's immediate threat, knight b4, followed by knight d3 check. Going back to knight 6 d5, well, white can't play d3 either, because then the knight on b5 is dropping. So, going back to knight fd5 and the actual game now, where white played d4, we can see that white's choice was not an easy one. Well, black got on with the job here. It's black's job to mess white around. f6 hit the queen, queen drops back to protect knight on b5, and now black opens things up with e5. A very necessary move. When you're ahead in development, you must attack, or your advantage will evaporate. Therefore, e5 is thoroughly consistent. Lamoureux took the pawn, and now comes another disruptive move. Check on b4. And we get now the fluid development so characteristic of the modern Scandinavian. We'll see this type of thing in the Icelandic Gambit a lot, where black's development is really souped up at the cost of material. Yes, white's gone grabbing pawns, but look at the pieces there doing nothing on the back rank. And of course, immediate disaster is threatened for white on the e-file. f4, not a happy move. F takes e5, f takes e5, and now another really excellent move by Goldenberg here. Rook takes e5. That exposes the whole white setup as inadequate. Obviously white's got to take that rook. Rook e8. What else has white got other than to take? Knight e2, and black doesn't even waste any time taking that knight on b5. Instead he goes for the jugular with bishop d3, bishop d1, and now queen takes b5, completes the demolition job. So white resigned. Just dropping back one move here to the position after bishop d3. Well, some might ask what would have happened after knight b to d5. There black can go in for the kill with a move like knight takes c3. So white was lost anyway. So okay, that's a good example of the slightly unusual play that is featured in the bishop b5 check line, and also a warning to white. It's not at all easy to play these positions, particularly after you've played that ugly move f3. Well, now we come to a line which is regarded as a more searching test of black's resources in the line with bishop b5 check, bishop d7, bishop c4, bishop g4, f3, bishop f5, knight c3, all very logical and forced. Knight bd7, it's knight ge2. Obviously this move threatens a move like knight g3. White can think about moves like knight f4, and of course white can castle more quickly in this line than he could in the previous line where queen came to e2. Didn't seem to work out. On queen e2, you know, white seems to be basing his whole game on a cheapo, that idea of attacking c7. Well, now we come to the game Sergeyev versus Dmitry Saulin, played in the Tula Afromiavoy Memorial 2006. And after knight e2, black played the thematic move knight to b6. Bishop came to b3. Once again, I should mention the fact that bishop b5 check isn't an especially effective move. Bishop d7, it's difficult for white to keep his pawn in this position on d5. What we see in this game is actually white ceding this pawn on d5, and now we get this normal type of position cropping up where white plays d4, where you have to wonder about the value of this hideous looking move f3. How is white going to make something of his position when, you know, the thing that he would much rather like to do is to play f3, f2. You know, that would be white's favoured move in this position, I'm sure. As it is, he's got to reckon with some serious dark square weaknesses in his camp, notably the square e3. I'm not saying this position is worse for white, not by any means, just that black is very comfortable. All of his pieces aren't really interrupted coming into play. Black has the c5 pawn break at his disposal. That move will open up perspectives for the queen and rooks. And, you know, black's just got a decent game in this position. So what Sergeyev does is essentially to recognise this and just to try to develop his pieces very solidly. White doesn't do anything ambitious in this opening. He just tries to stick to the basics, getting his pieces out. But here's c5, and, you know, this is a rather difficult move for white to meet, particularly after he's played f3. Black is striking at the dark squares. White's got to take that pawn, really. And now the bishop comes into the game. Nice, easy moves. After which black brings his queen to c7. And after that, certainly moves like rook fd8 and rook a c8 are on the cards. Maybe even rook fd8 and double rooks in the d file. So knight e4, what can you do? You've got to carry on. Rook fd8, very easy play. Knight takes bishop, queen takes, queen b3. White adopts a simplistic approach, reducing the amount of material on the board, hoping that the e3 weakness won't tell. Well, judge for yourselves, as black tries to take over the initiative, as he should, because he's got an extra rook in play as well as a knight, with a5. White goes a4, and now rook a6. Black finds a very effective way of getting his rook into the game. And now you see this is problematic, this position for white. White hasn't really got a square for his bishop on c1. that makes any sense. Moreover, black is threatening moves like rook b6, followed maybe by queen c4, just taking control of the board. And I'm not sure what white has to said against that. So Sergeyev goes in for the brave, or some might call it suicidal, pawn grab on b7. At least this tests the whole black concept. You know, white figures that if he's got a terrible position, he may as well be material ahead. And I think he's right in that idea, you know. Nevertheless, I think this move, queen takes b7, was ludicrously risky, as we're about to see. As what happens really is that white's queen gets trapped. Now, after queen c6, black's threatening rook a8, and there's no real natural move for white to avoid this idea. Try finding a move for white. It's hard with all your pieces undeveloped. So Sergeyev goes c4, recognising this position is a disaster for him. He's got to give back a pawn. Now black hits the rook on f1, white plays bishop e3. Clever move, clever alright, decoying the knight away from the defence of the rook, and if knight takes e3 in this position, queen takes b6, hits the rook on d8. So, clever enough, but rook b8, black is still much better. Bishop f2, rook a8, white's being pushed around the campus. Queen a6, rook fd1, rook db8. Classic pressure along the queenside open files, and that unassailable knight on d5. Beautiful position for black. Rook b4 just piling in. Bishop c5, rook c4. And either white lost on time in this position, or he got so depressed with what was actually going on the board that he decided to resign. Slightly surprising. It's not an everyday resignation, not a position where you would imagine that anybody would simply resign, but there's no doubt about it. Black has much the better game. Black's probably going to continue with rook a c8, moves like queen c6 come into focus, and then some sort of penetration to the 7th rank. Meanwhile, white's queenside pawns are pretty weak. White probably lost on time, that's my guess. But this is another good game, demonstrating the potential of black's counterplay in this tricky variation.